Now, if you've been paying attention over here at Black Bear Forge, you know that I'm really not much of a knife maker. I started off thinking I was going to be a knife maker, but quickly realized that I wasn't really all that good at it, and the competition is quite steep in the custom knife market. Plus, I really enjoy general blacksmithing a little more than I enjoy making knives. But sometimes you're just sort of compelled to make a knife of one sort or the other. And today I thought we would take a look at a simple utilitarian knife. Very simple to make. It doesn't have all the detail that make the high art knives and the custom knives so difficult to compete in. This is just something to have around the shop, either the blacksmith shop for opening packages and things like that, or in the wood shop for actually using as a woodworking tool. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing this, but I think it's called a Kiridashi, something like that. But it's a single bevel knife, and it's very similar to the woodworker's marking knives I've made, but it's a little bit bigger blade, a little bit more substantial handle, and it doesn't have a wooden handle. There's no slabs put on this, although they could be. I've seen them done that way. But most of them seem to just be the handle drawn out, and they generally taper, and this is generally at a fairly sharp angle, but again, single bevel. I'm starting with a piece of 5160. This is 1/4 by 1 1/4 material, and it's just a little bit over 6 inches long. So that makes it about 6 millimeters by 30 millimeters, by 155 millimeters. I've seen these in all sorts of different sizes. I think this is going to be a fairly large version of this. I've seen quite small ones. I've seen very short handles, long handles, and like I say, I've seen some of them have wooden slabs put on them so that it's a little bit more comfortable. But we're going to keep this simple. I'm going to do this all with hand tools, except for cutting the material. I cut this on the chop saw. But if you have a annealed tool steel, you can cut it with a hacksaw, so that's not a problem. But just to keep things simple, I think we're going to do it as much as we can by hand tools. There might be a little bit of a cheat with a grinder if something's giving me trouble or if it's just taking too long. But if you forge it as close to final size as you can, there's not that much filing to do. You file it, you harden it and temper it, and then you can do as much hand sanding as you want. I don't think I'm going to do a lot because I don't think this needs to be highly polished, even though a lot of them are. In fact, you see a lot of these made out of Damascus, and they're really good looking knives made out of Damascus. But we're just going to make a real simple one out of this piece of 5160. So let's head over to the forge. Let's get started. People always ask about the tongs I'm using. I think most of this, if not all of it, I will just use this pair of slotted jaw tongs that were made by Mike Boone many years ago. Got them at a blacksmithing conference. I'm going to start by drawing out the handle part. And do that over the horn. I'm going to knock these corners back because in the end I want a kind of a round handle on the end. I'm not worried about this getting a little bit thick as it tapers out here, especially working by hand. Under a power hammer, I'd probably take it all back to the same thickness, but not completely necessary. Number one priority here is a functional tool. If you got a bunged up anvil, try to find the smoothest spot you can to work over because it'll make for less filing in the long run. The closer you can get this to the finished size at the anvil, the less filing you'll have to do. And if you're hand filing, that's pretty darn important. I'm going to start lifting this up a little bit as I forge it because I want to curve in the handle. You can certainly work over the horn and curve it that way. But that lifting technique isn't bad. I'm trying to knock the corners down a little bit. Again, make it as smooth as you can. And if you want to get in here with a rounding hammer or something, that would be a very reasonable thing to do, but I'm trying to limit the different tools as much as I can. However, if you have a flatter, this is a good place to use it to try and smooth out any extra bumps and lumps here. And I'll do this again later at a higher heat, just showing you the option right now. But I think we're going to go ahead and trim the end of this. I actually want this cut right through here because that's the angle most of these seem to have. Just clean that transition up a little bit better there. Now think about how you want to trim this. Like I say, they always seem to be at a sharp angle in a straight line. They're not curved blades. But because it's a single bevel, and you're going to end up with a bevel after you cut it with your Hardy, I think, for me, I'm right-handed. I'm more likely to use this right-handed. If I cut it this way, then my bevel ends up on the right side and my straight ends up on the left. And that means if I'm working with a square, it's much more convenient as a right-handed woodworker. So that's why I'm going to make this one. And if you decide this isn't what you meant to do, it's not that hard to fix it by filing or grinding. But if you get this right, it just saves you a little. Don't cut all the way through. Probably could have gone a little further with that, but there you go. And then you can see that that's got the tip of the bevel established. It's way too steep a bevel, but we'll be able to fix that. So now I'm just going to work on that bevel a little bit. I can work it from the top side, and I can raise it up this way and smooth it out here. Unfortunately, my anvil's a little rough there, so I end up with some stuff that I don't like. So go back to doing it that way. And it might be convenient to make one in the left and one in the right. Now, another common feature seems to be a lanyard hole in the end of the handle, or maybe it's just to hang it on a nail. But since we're going to try and do this without power tools, let's punch the hole instead of drilling the hole. See if I can do this before I lose all my heat. Punching through into a bolster makes for a much cleaner hole. But I don't want a sharp-edged hole, so I'm going to come back with a ball punch and just knock the edges down a little bit and give it a little bit of a bevel. And then I'll probably drive this through again just to clean it up. Certainly nothing wrong with drilling this, especially if you anneal the material after you're done forging. But if you don't have a drill and you're trying to do this all by hand, punching is your option. The only reason I'm doing this is because I may have put the sides of the hole squished in there, and this cleans that up a little bit. So there we have a nice hole in there. This is definitely the kind of thing that I like to put my touch mark on. Make sure I'm putting it on the right side. I want it on the side with the bevel. Yep. Not that it matters that much. This is a tool I'm going to keep in my shop, not going out for sale. This is a good time to come back with the flatter. If you don't have one, just plan to do a little bit more filing or leave it a little rougher. Both are options. But try to do it over a smooth spot of the anvil without a bunch of scale on the anvil and without a bunch of scale on your blade here. Just a light straightening. Make sure it's not twisted. And then I'm going to anneal this in my bucket of vermiculite. Now, by cooling this blade as slowly as possible, it will be softer, it'll be easier to file. If you're using a belt grinder, it won't wear out your belts quite as fast if it's annealed. After we're through filing, grinding, whatever it is you're going to do with it, then I'll run it through a couple of normalizing cycles to make sure it's still stress-free and ready to harden and temper. Something like a hammerhead, I usually leave in the vermiculite overnight. This will probably cool off in the next hour, so I'll get back to it here pretty quick. And we'll do some filing. Now, we could have hot filed this, but it's going to cool off so fast in the vise, you're not going to get much work done. You're back and forth to the forge, and I'm not sure that that's really good use of time or forge fuel. So I think we're going to do all the filing cold. But again, if you have a belt grinder, an angle grinder, any of those things, those are fair game. I'm just trying to show you don't have to have all those things. So I've gone ahead and roughed out two of these. I've got a right-handed one and a left-handed one, and that'll come in a little bit more handy in the shop, I think. Sometimes you want right, sometimes you want left. And I think we're going to go ahead and just work on the right-handed one. Process is the same. I'll end up getting them both done at the same time, but I don't think we need to show all that. In fact, I'm not going to show all the filing anyways because it all looks the same. It's just where you need to file. First thing I think I'm going to do is take care of this back. I want that a nice, even curve, and I don't want this little kick up that I've got there. And I just want to get the big lumps out of it. I'm not too worried about making it perfect because it's not where I'm going with this. If you want it perfect, take the time and make it perfect. And if you have a grinder, by all means, go ahead and use it like I said earlier. But if you're interested in making knives and you learn by hand filing and hand sanding, you will improve your forging skills considerably because you won't want to do any more filing than you absolutely have to. And the cleaner you're forging, the less filing you have to do. You know, what about the flats? I'm not at all worried about this up here unless there's a sharp spot or a really uncomfortable lump that's going to affect the way it holds in the hand. But I do need to make sure the back has been filed pretty darn flat because you can't get a sharp edge if it isn't smooth and polished. And to do that, I'm going to put a piece of angle iron in the vise. And then I'm going to vice grip this to the piece of angle iron. People that do a lot of knives by hand have all sorts of ways to hold things, but this doesn't work too bad. It'll slip a little probably, but certainly workable. And you just have to keep going until this is all smooth for at least about the last inch there. And you don't want to round it, which is really hard not to do. And there we go. So that gets the back flat. I'd like to break these edges a little bit more, but the vise is kind of in the way, so one way you could do that is just to stand it up. And perhaps a better way to do that would be to go to a filing vise if you have one. I think that's all I'm going to do to this. Like I say, you can polish that up completely if you want to. And at this point, you might want to go through with some various grits of hand sanding, but I think I'm going to not worry about that. Down here, it will need a lot more after it's hardened and tempered. But let's go normalize this a few times. And normalizing then is just bringing it up to temperature and letting it air cool. It's different from annealing in that annealing you want it to cool as slowly as possible, and that makes it as soft as possible. But normalizing is really just stress relieving. It reduces the chance that things are going to warp, twist, crack. And the serious knife makers say 3 normalizing cycles is ideal. I don't know that something this simple with that little short blade needs quite that much, but certainly if you're working on longer knives or even swords, I'd pay attention to the real knife makers more than I'd pay attention to me. But I think we will normalize this at least twice. I'm going to turn the heat down so it comes up to heat as slowly as possible, and I'm going to start with the handle end. I'm just going to set it aside and let it cool. And while that's cooling, I'm going to heat up a bar to preheat my oil. Now for my third and final normalizing cycle, I'm just going to turn the forge all the way off and let it stay hot and put these in there. And as the forge cools down, then I'll take them out and let them air cool again. And I think these are plenty stress relieved. In the next heat cycle, we will harden. Okay, now it's time to go ahead and harden. And again, I'm going to turn that off and let it just soak a little bit to get a nice even heat. So this will take a minute or two with it turned off, and then I'll turn it back on and bring it up to the final heat. Some people put a piece of heavy wall steel tubing in the forge to heat up, and that does make it a little bit more even. If I ever get serious about knives again, I'll probably look into that. As normal, work it up and down. Try not to go side to side with this because you can warp a blade pushing it side to side. As it gets cooler, you can do a little bit more, but then what I'm going to do is first I want to check it with a file. That's glass hard, it won't file at all. I'm going to clean it up with this little piece of brick here. And see if the tempering colors will run. I only quenched it up into here. And you should be able to see the temper colors here. Sometimes they don't show up quite the same on camera as they do for me, so I'd have to take my word for it. But we're into a bright blue and a dark blue, purple, bronze, and straw color, and it's slowly moving this way. It's just a matter of whether I left enough heat there to get that to run all the way. If it doesn't, I will just put it in the toaster oven and do it. But this does work, and if you need to, you can heat up a block of steel and set this on it and use that to encourage the colors to run a little bit. We're now into the straw range here, which is kind of what I want, but we aren't here. So I'm going to just quench that corner, if I can. Yeah, I ended up quenching the whole thing a little bit there. Yeah, it's definitely running more into this corner, so I'm going to quench the whole thing and I'm going to put it in the toaster oven to get that even. But you don't have to use an electric oven to do this. You can do it all at the forge. You can do it with a torch, but it's real easy to get the colors to run too fast with a torch. Well, we've got our blade all hardened and tempered. It's been rough ground, but it's far from being sharp. I've left this probably about the thickness of a dime, which helps it hold up during the heat treatment process. It's really easy to burn, decarburize, overheat, cause problems if you get the edge too thin. So I prefer to leave it a little bit thick. And of course, working on a belt grinder, that's really no big deal. It just takes a couple of extra minutes to grind everything down, get the back good and flat, work on the bevel, and then you're on to the sharpening process. Doing it by hand may take just a little longer, but it's completely possible to do this by hand. If it's properly hardened and tempered, you should be able to cut it with a file. It's not going to cut real easily. If it cuts easily, it's not hard enough. If it doesn't cut at all, it's probably too hard. So you should be able to cut it with a file. So that's where I'm going to start, is with a smooth file, so it leaves a nice smooth finish. And we're going to get it as close to sharp as I can with the file before we go on to the stones. As far as stones go, you've got all sorts of different choices. I've got man-made stones, you can get natural Arkansas stones, there are Japanese water stones, and you can even use abrasive papers adhered to something like a granite slab, or even wrap them around a block and work them by hand, which is what a lot of people do. I've just got that held in some vise grips that I can then put in the vise. You want to be really careful at this point because you really don't want to start rounding things over. You just want to make sure the back is perfectly flat and true. You can tell just right from the start that it isn't perfect. Once I get that all the way down, then I'm going to draw file it. And this will leave finer scratches by pulling the file than what you had by working it normally. I'm going to flip it over, and we're going to do the bevel. I've just got this little bevel gauge. It's a Richard Kell bevel gauge. You can find them online. I'm trying to go for a 25-degree bevel. It's pretty good. Well, that's about 10-15 minutes of hand filing, but that's just darn near sharp now, so now it's time to go to the stones. And I'm going to start with this coarse man-made stone here. It's just a little bit coarser than any of my oil stones. In fact, I'm probably going to go to a diamond stone, is what I prefer. First thing I want to do is flatten the back. It's a lot like preparing a brand new wood chisel. Since it's a chisel edge, it's going to be used very much like a chisel in some cases. And you want to keep going until you get a nice even pattern here. I don't know if you can see that in the camera, but it's polishing right in the middle, but not quite the edges, so it's a little bit crowned. Now, you woodworkers probably have your own method of sharpening. There are so many different approaches to sharpening, I'm not even going to try to tell you that mine is the best way. I think that's pretty good. I'm going to do the same thing with the bevel, and I just want to start back and rock it up until it's tight. I kind of like to think of this as being covered with hair and you're trying to shave it. And I try not to rock it up and down, but it doesn't hurt much. Okay, there's a burr all the way across. So now I'm going to go to my diamond stones, and I have a set of 3 diamond stones, a 250, an 800, and a 1200 grit. And for these, instead of using oil, I use a little bit of just glass cleaner, automotive glass cleaner. And they're set in a board here, so they clamp to the vise. If you've ever watched Paul Sellers, he's a woodworker, and this is a method he recommends, and it works really nicely. Just a little bit of this is all it takes. And again, I'm going to start with the back. And that'll get that burr off that I had. And really starts to shine this up pretty nicely. Now, this isn't the best system for sharpening a regular knife because you can't get in here at all the stones. But for flat back things like chisels, plane blades, and this style knife, this works quite well. And I try to use the whole stone so I wear them evenly. But unlike water stones and oil stones, these diamond plates stay flat. You won't have to flatten them after using them for a while. Water stones you got to flatten pretty much every time you use them. One reason I quit using water stones. So there's a burr on the 250. I'm not going to worry too much about the back on the medium stone here. It's just kind of hard to get to. I've got a burr on the medium grit. Going to drag the burr off the edge there. I'm going to go kind of back and forth on this stone just to make sure I'm getting the back and the front polished. Not as concerned about raising a burr at this point because I know I've already been there. You can actually see the burr, or I can. I don't know if you can see that or not, but as I move my finger, it kind of gets shiny right there, and that's the burr moving back and forth. And for his final step, I'm going to strop it. This just takes a little buffing compound. Yeah, it's got the burr all worked off of it there. That should be ready to use. Like I say, sharpening is one of those things you get as hung up on as you want. There are people very passionate about all forms of sharpening, this stone, that stone, always use power tools, never use power tools, water cooled, oil cooled, whatever it is, people are really passionate. And I'm not here to tell you how to sharpen, I'm just showing you how I'm doing it. But it's sharp. Now, what sort of thing would you use these for? Well, typically, my understanding is that these were Japanese wood carving and carpenter's knives. So I'd use it more as a carpenter's knife for doing layout work and some fine trimming, things like that. But I've seen people do some wood carving. In fact, Torbjörn Amon did a video several years ago where he made a similar knife to this, and he did a little bit of wood carving right at the very end. So if you haven't seen his video, it's worth checking out. But let me show you a little bit of layout work and just sort of how I might use something like this. Now frequently when you're cutting with a saw, you'll end up raising some chips along the edge. Well, this wood behaves pretty well, but if you want to avoid that, making a knife line, and that's why I have a left and a right, and really make sure you hold the square tight. But by making that line there, this is the outside of my cut. Then I can also bring this in and I can clean that out just a little bit and create a little bit of a V-notch. And that gives me a wonderful place to start my saw. And because I've already severed this end grain, it doesn't chip on this side, which would be my good side in that cut. Now if I want to do the same thing on the other side, fitting a shelf or something like that, then I can use the left-handed knife. And it'll get in there just the same way. Now for a lot of things I'm just going to use the right-handed one. I'm not sure I need both for much more than this one application. But that then makes a nice clean cut. And you can come back in then even with these same knives and use them like a chisel because of the way they're designed. Of course I made that first cut, so I might as well just pop that all the way out to there. But they're not a bad little handheld chisel you can push with your hands this way. I'm not going to do everything, but there's some places where these will just be real problem solvers. You can also take this and do some simple little wood carving elements. I'm not much of a wood carver, so this is sort of out of my league here, but kind of gives you the idea, some little sort of chip carving type details you might be able to do with it. Again, check out Torbjörn's video because it's really good on that kind of stuff. And another thing that it would be good for is leather work, because that cuts leather very nicely. Now I'm sure the longer I have these knives around, the more I'll find to do with them, and I'll probably make some more. I think these look handy enough, but I think these may be a little bit on the overly large size. I think I might make one about 1/2 to 3/4 the size that these are. Probably only in the right hand because I think it's going to be the most useful. But I can see a lot of applications for these knives. I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button down there. Feel free to stick around, watch a few of the other videos. Of course, share the videos with your friends. If you'd like to provide financial support for the videos here at Black Bear Forge, there are links down in the video description for both PayPal and Patreon. There's absolutely no obligation. Those are merely donations. The content is free. In the meantime, I hope you have time in your day to get out to your shop. Stay safe, make sure you're washing your hands, make sure you wear your safety glasses, and we will see you for the next one.